Pollux's escape pod drifted helplessly, the last chance for the abused Ithorian child abandoned by her species to the cold clutches of the asteroid field's gravity well. But one human, ex-Marine Jacob Clark, couldn't ignore her fading distress beacon as he piloted his cargo ship through the treacherous tumbling boulders of the Ithor graveyard. Jacob's conscience gnawed at him as he weaved his small vessel ever closer to the weakened life sign aboard the battered pod. Its damaged hull looked one impact away from cracking like an egg. He hailed the pod. No response. He watched the pod start to slip free from its unstable perch on the massive asteroid. The pod plummeted towards the unforgiving surface of the planetoid far below. Jacob gunned his engines, maneuvering underneath the falling pod. His ship jolted as he used the hull to shove the pod to a stable trajectory. Engaging the tractor beam, he guided it into his cargo bay. Inside the pod, a terrified Ithorian girl about 8 years old cowered behind a barricade of crates. She clutched a sharpened scrap of metal, ready to fight for her life, shrieking as Jacob pried open the battered hatch. He approached slowly, hands up. "Easy there, I'm here to help you." Jacob backed off as she brandished the crude shiv with a shaky grip. He unwrapped a nutrient bar from his pocket and held it out to her. Pollux snatched it and scarfed it down, still eyeing him warily. When Jacob tried to access the pod's data logs, Pollux became hysterical, screaming an agonized plea that the ship's translator deciphered, not back to Ithor." Jacob's heart clenched. Something awful had happened to this child, and her own people had left her to die. Flashes of his own battlefield trauma threatened to swallow Jacob into dark memories. He squeezed his eyes shut and shook off the dread, focusing on the trembling girl. Her malnutrition was severe. She needed a doctor, a human doctor. He couldn't turn her over to the Ithorian authorities until he knew the truth. "We're going to see a human doctor to help you get better. No one's going to hurt you again." At this, Pollux flung herself into Jacob's arms, sobbing. He patted her back awkwardly as he plotted a course away from Ithorian space. Deep in Jacob's gut, a cold knot formed. Pollux's story could blow the lid off something the Ithorians wanted buried. He and this fragile child might have just become the most wanted fugitives in the sector. Humanity had a long history of sheltering the oppressed and downtrodden. But how far would mankind go to protect one alien girl from her own kind? Jacob guided Pollux through the bustling corridors of the Arcturian Vagrant, a massive space station, carved into an asteroid that served as a nexus for all manner of spaces, from miners to merchants to vagabonds. The unlikely pair wove through the throngs of aliens, the child's small hand gripping Jacob's tightly. They arrived at the free clinic, a small dingy office tucked away in a forgotten corner of the station. As they waited for the doctor, Jacob's eyes fell upon a wall plastered with wanted posters. His blood ran cold as he spotted Pollux's face staring back at him, a sizable bounty listed beneath her image. No reason was given for her wanted status. Jacob's instinct screamed at him to flee, to get Pollux as far away from here as possible. He was about to scoop her up and make a break for it when an older woman emerged from the back, her eyes widening in recognition as she saw Pollux. Without a word, she hustled them into a private exam room, locking the door behind them. "I'm Dr. Sani," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. "I've treated Pollux before. She's from a wealthy Ithorian family, but something sinister is happening. Family members have been dying under mysterious circumstances. Pollux is the only survivor of an attack that wiped out her parents and siblings a month ago." Jacob's stomach churned as Sani continued. "The wounds I treated, they were consistent with torture. Her extended family claimed custody, but now they say she's a runaway. They're offering a huge reward for her return. I suspect someone in the family is behind the deaths and wants to eliminate Pollux as the last loose end." "Why not go to the authorities?" Jacob asked, already dreading the answer. Sani shook her head grimly. "The family has deep ties to the Ithorian government and law enforcement. Those wanted posters prove it. You and Pollux are in grave danger. It's only a matter of time before they track her here." Jacob's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. Sani leaned in close. There's an information broker named Rix who might be able to help unravel this conspiracy, but he's paranoid, only meets in person at a seedy bar in the worst part of the station. Jacob knew it was a tremendous risk, but what choice did they have? He nodded to Sani, then took Pollux's hand once more. They slipped out of the clinic and melted into the vagrants' labyrinthine corridors, the dim lights casting eerie shadows. Jacob felt eyes on them, but when he glanced back, he saw only the throng of passers-by. Little did he know, a cloaked figure lurked just out of sight, tracking their every move. The hunter had found its prey. The vagrant's decaying innards wound before Jacob, a maze of rusted bulkheads and flickering lights. Pollux's hand squeezed his as they ventured deeper into the station's decaying bowels. With each twist and turn, the air grew thicker with the reek of blood, sweat, and furtive vices. Pollux's trembling intensified. Jacob's stomach twisted with guilt for leading a child into this abyss, but their options had narrowed to a razor's edge. A battered sign announced their arrival at the Rusted Blade. It hunched in the shadows, more scar than structure. They crossed the threshold into a realm of cheap smoke and hard stares from patrons both human and alien. Jacob guided Pollux to a corner table, away from prying eyes. He flagged down the bartender and ordered a Saurian whiskey, neat. The drink arrived, a toxic green in a grimy glass. Jacob left it untouched, scanning the room for their contact. There, in the far corner, a hooded figure met Jacob's gaze. A subtle tilt of the head beckoned them over. Jacob approached, positioning himself between Pollux and the stranger. "You, Rix?" His voice cut through the murky haze. Hands emerged from the robe, pulling back the hood to reveal a face carved by hardship. Scars crisscrossed skin like a grim tapestry. "Depends who's asking," the voice rasped, roughened by years of cheap tobacco. Jacob relayed their tale and Sani's grim insights. The name piqued Rix's interest, his eyes narrowing. Might know a thing or two about Ithor's mess. He leaned in, voice lowering to a ragged whisper. "But it'll cost—" The world shattered in a blossom of fire and shrapnel. The blast hurled Jacob to the filthy floor, Pollux beneath him. His ears rang like claxons, drowning the screams of the wounded. Smoke stung his eyes as he pushed himself up on his elbows. The bar's entrance gaped like an open wound, framing armored silhouettes. Ithorian mercenaries poured into the room, plasma rifles hungry for targets. "The girl!" The lead hunter thrust his weapon at Jacob. "Hand her over!" Cold realization settled in Jacob's gut as he looked to Rix for aid. The information broker had vanished, leaving only tendrils of smoke. The trap had sprung, jaws eager to devour them both. Jacob saw one path, a desperate gambit. He snatched Pollux's arm and dove, pulling her behind the flimsy shelter of the bar. Plasma bolts rained overhead, searing the air where they'd stood a heartbeat before. Splinters of wood and glass exploded around Jacob as he shoved Pollux into the narrow opening, the searing heat of the grenade's blast licking at his back. They plummeted down the shaft, bouncing off the rusted metal walls before slamming onto the dimly lit catwalk below. The wind knocked from their lungs. They lay stunned for a heartbeat before the echoing clang of boots on metal spurred them into action. Pollux's terrified sobs punctuated each frantic step as they raced through the twisting maintenance tunnels, the red emergency lights flickering ominously. Jacob's heart pounded in his ears, nearly drowning out the approaching thunder of their pursuers. Rounding a corner at breakneck speed, they skidded to a halt, confronted by a dead end. Jacob spun around, ready to backtrack, but the guttural voices of the mercenaries froze him in place. He frantically scanned the walls, his eyes landing on a rusted access door. Wrenching it open with a grunt, he ushered Pollux inside before slipping in himself, pulling the door shut with a dull clang. The room was small and dark, filled with the hum of machinery. The musty smell of recycled air filled Jacob's nostrils. They were in one of the vagrants' atmospheric processing units. Suddenly, the machinery ground to a halt, plunging them into suffocating darkness. Jacob pulled Pollux close, hardly daring to breathe. A flicker. Then the emergency lights bathed the room in an eerie crimson glow. Shadows danced on the walls as Jacob strained to hear past the pounding of his own heart. The mercenaries' voices drifted through the door, low and menacing. "Shut down the entire sector. Can't hide forever." The heavy footfalls receded, and Jacob let out a shaky breath, but the respite was fleeting. A voice deep and grating echoed through the chamber. "I know you're in there." Jacob spun, pushing Pollux behind him as Rix materialized from the shadows, a plasma pistol aimed at Jacob's chest. The information broker's face was grim, his eyes hard. "Sorry it had to be this way," he rasped, regret tinging his words. "They paid me a lot to find the girl, more than you could ever afford." Jacob's mind raced, desperately seeking an escape. But it was Pollux who moved, stepping out from behind him, her face set with determination. She stood at the edge of a large, spinning turbine, the blade's howl drowning out Jacob's cry of, "Pollux, no!" In a blink she was gone, leaping into the churning machine. Rix lunged forward with a curse, but Jacob tackled him, grappling for the gun. They crashed to the floor, rolling in a desperate struggle as the turbine's blades ground to a slow halt. Pollux's limp form tumbled from the machine, landing in a crumpled heap on the grated floor. Jacob's heart stopped. She lay unmoving, her small body broken and still. Pollux lay as still as death in Jacob's arms as he raced through the maintenance tunnels, his boots clanging on the rusted metal grating. He skidded to a halt next to her crumpled form, his chest constricting with dread. Gently, he scooped her up, cradling her battered body against his chest. To his amazement, he felt the faint rise and fall of her breathing. She was alive, if only just. Rix groaned behind them, struggling to rise. Jacob paid him no heed. He had to get Pollux out of here, away from the hunters. Deeper into the bowels of the vagrant he plunged, the grimy walls pressing in on them as the air grew thick and stale. Pollux stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Pain and fear swam in her dark eyes as she gazed up at Jacob. "Why? They want me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of distant machinery. Jacob's heart clenched. He had no answers for her, only empty reassurances. "Don't know, but I won't let them hurt you, never again." Then a fragment of memory surfaced. A drunken spacer's tale whispered across a grimy bar years ago. The Sentinels, a clandestine network of humans dedicated to aiding the galaxy's oppressed and forgotten. At the time he'd scoffed. Now it seemed like their only hope, if they even existed. A flicker of light ahead snapped him back to the present. He quickened his pace, hope rising in his chest. Then a figure stepped from the shadows and he froze, clutching Pollux tighter. The man was tall and lean, silver hair gleaming in the dim light. His black tunic bore a strange emblem, a stylized eye encircled by stars. His eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to see straight through Jacob. "Jacob Clark." The man's voice was soft but commanding. "We've been watching you. We know what you've done for her." He nodded to Pollux's still form. "Come. We can keep her safe." Jacob hesitated, suspicion warring with desperation. Could he trust this stranger? Did he have a choice? He glanced down at Pollux, her face pale and bruised. For her, he had to try. Jaw clenched, he gave the man a sharp nod. "Lead the way." Jacob clung to the shadows as he followed the enigmatic figure deeper into the bowels of the vagrant. The grimy, rust-eaten walls seemed to close in around them as they wound through the labyrinthine corridors, the air growing thick and stale. Only the faint glow of emergency lights lit their path, casting an eerie red pall over the mysterious man's angular features. Minutes stretched into hours or so, it seemed, as they trudged on in tense silence. Just as Jacob's patience wore thin, they arrived at a nondescript door, unremarkable save for the sophisticated biometric scanner. The man pressed his palm to the device, and with a soft hiss, the door slid open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the decrepit tunnels, a haven of advanced technology amidst the decay. Banks of computer terminals blinked and hummed, their screens casting a cool glow across the space. Holographic displays flickered with incomprehensible data, while surveillance feeds played out across an array of monitors, offering a patchwork view of the vagrant's many levels. "I am Alistair," the man said, his voice low and measured as he turned to face Jacob. "A senior operative of the Sentinels. We've been monitoring the situation on Ithor, and we believe a powerful criminal syndicate, the Shadow Collective, is responsible for the deaths of the girl's family." He gestured to Pollux, who huddled close to Jacob, her eyes wide and haunted in the dim light. "They seek her for their illegal genetic experiments. They believe she holds the key to a breakthrough." Jacob's grip tightened on Pollux's shoulder, a surge of protective anger welling within him. Alistair's gaze softened. "We can offer you sanctuary, protection, but you must be cautious. Trust no one. The Collective's reach is vast and—" That a piercing alarm shattered the tense calm. Alistair whirled to the monitors, his face paling as he brought up a video feed. Armed men, clad in black, surged through the maintenance tunnels, weapons at the ready, heading straight for them. "They've tracked you." Alistair's words were clipped, his movements urgent as he thrust a plasma pistol into Jacob's hand and began shoving equipment into a duffel. "We need to move, now." And then they were running, retracing their steps through the twisting corridors, Alistair leading the way. The thud of boots on metal echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. A plasma bolt sizzled past Jacob's ear, close enough to singe his hair. He pivoted, squeezing off a shot that dropped one of their pursuers, but more rounded the corner, weapons blazing. Alistair lobbed a grenade behind them, the explosion rocking the narrow passage. "This way!" He veered down a side tunnel, Jacob and Pollux close on his heels. They burst into a cavernous chamber, a high domed ceiling arching overhead, and there in the center a sleek spacecraft, an escape pod. Alistair sprinted for it, his fingers flying over the control panel. Jacob hesitated, looking back the way they'd come. "What about the other Sentinels? We can't just leave them." Alistair's shoulders slumped, his face etched with grief as he turned to Jacob. "There are no other Sentinels, not anymore. The Collective hunted us down, one by one. I'm the last." Jacob reeled, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. But there was no time to process, no time to grieve. Plasma bolts streaked through the chamber, the Collective's forces closing in. Alistair shoved Jacob and Pollux into the escape pod, leaping in after them. The hatch slammed shut, a bolt scorching the hull mere inches from Jacob's face. And then they were free, the pod blasting away from the vagrant, hurtling into the cold embrace of space. The ships of their pursuers shrank to pinpricks behind them, swallowed by the vast emptiness. Jacob slumped back in his seat, his heart racing, Pollux trembling beside him. Alistair's words echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain. If the Sentinels were gone, who would help them now? In the cramped confines of the escape pod, Jacob sat hunched over the controls, his eyes glued to the sensor readouts. The vast emptiness of space stretched out before them, an inky void broken only by the occasional pinprick of distant starlight. Behind him, Alistair crouched next to Pollux, carefully applying a salve to the girl's bruises and cuts. The pod's meager medical supplies were hardly sufficient, but it was all they had. Hours crawled by, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the pod's life support systems and Pollux's occasional whimpers of pain. Jacob's nerves were stretched taut, his eyes darting to the sensors at every imagined flicker. But there was no sign of pursuit, no indication that the Collective had followed them from the vagrant. As the adrenaline began to ebb, exhaustion took its place. Jacob's eyelids grew heavy, his head nodding forward before he jerked it back up, blinking rapidly. He couldn't afford to sleep, not yet. "We need a plan," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "We can't just drift out here forever." Alistair looked up from his ministrations, his face drawn and haggard in the dim light. "There's a moon," he said slowly, as if dredging the information from some long-forgotten corner of his memory. "Remote, uninhabited. We could lay low there, gather our wits." Alistair rattled off a string of numbers, which Jacob punched into the navigation system. The pod's engines hummed to life, propelling them towards their new destination. As they approached the moon, Jacob frowned at the readouts scrolling across the screen. The surface was scarred and pitted, deep canyons and craters marring its face. It looked like it had been on the receiving end of an orbital bombardment. The older man's face was tight with unease. "It's been years," he admitted, "but it's the best chance we've got." Jacob guided the pod down into a sheltered canyon, the walls rising up on either side like the jaws of some great beast. They touched down with a gentle bump, the engines whining as they powered down. The moon's atmosphere was thin and cold, biting at their skin as they emerged from the pod. Jacob took the lead, Pollux clinging to his hand as Alistair brought up the rear. They picked their way through the rocky terrain, the canyon floor strewn with boulders and debris. Nestled into the canyon wall, almost invisible from a distance, was a small nondescript structure. It was built from the same dull grey rock as the surrounding landscape, as if it had grown organically from the moon itself. "One of our old safe houses," Alistair explained as they approached, "from back in the day when the Sentinels were still a force to be reckoned with." Inside, the base was dark and cold, the air stale with disuse. Alistair found the main power switch and the lights flickered on, casting a sickly green glow over the interior. The place was in a state of disarray, consoles overturned and equipment scattered across the floor. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Alistair made his way to the main computer terminal, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to bring up the base's systems. Jacob settled Pollux on a dusty cot in the corner, draping a moth-eaten blanket over her shoulders. "I've got something," Alistair called, his voice tight with tension. Jacob hurried over, peering over the other man's shoulder at the screen. It was a security log, time-stamped a few months prior. As Alistair scrolled through the entries, his face grew grimmer and grimmer. "The Collective," he said, his voice hollow. "They found this place, attacked it. There's no record of any survivors." But Alistair was still reading, his eyes widening in shock. "It wasn't just us they were after," he breathed. "They were looking for something specific, a piece of ancient tech called the Nexus Key." He brought up another entry, a frantic, hurried transmission. "The key has been hidden," he read aloud. "Coordinates encrypted. They're coming. We can't hold them off much longer." Jacob's blood ran cold as the implications sank in. The Collective wouldn't stop, not until they had the key and Pollux. Suddenly an alarm blared through the base, red lights flashing in warning. Jacob's heart leapt into his throat. They'd been found. "We have to go," he yelled, grabbing Pollux and sprinting for the door. Alistair was close behind, his face set in grim determination. They burst out of the base and ran for the escape pod, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Jacob risked a glance upward, his heart seizing at the sight of a swarm of ships descending on the moon, their weapons already firing. They dove into the pod, Alistair slamming the hatch shut behind them. Jacob's hands flew over the controls, the engines roaring to life. They blasted off, the canyon walls crumbling around them as the Collective's ships laid waste to the surface. As they hurtled away from the moon, Jacob's mind raced. They had no choice now. They had to find the Nexus Key before the Collective did. And somehow, impossibly, Pollux was the key to finding it. Jacob's fingers flew across the escape pod's control panel, desperately trying to decipher the encrypted coordinates. Alistair hunched over his shoulder, his brow furrowed in concentration. But the code remained stubbornly indecipherable, a maddening string of numbers and symbols that danced across the screen. Pollux huddled in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes haunted. Jacob's heart ached for the girl, for the horrors she'd endured, but there was no time for comfort, not with the Collective breathing down their necks. "It's no use," Alistair said finally, straightening up with a grimace. "We need help, someone with more experience in cryptography." Jacob frowned. "Who? We can't exactly go knocking on the Collective's door." Alistair shot him a wry grin. "Point taken, but Zephyr's on a whole other level. He's holed up on a space station called the Razor's Edge. It's a haven for the galaxy's most notorious outlaws and criminals. Jacob glanced at Pollux, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. "We don't have a choice," he said grimly. "Set a course for the Razor's Edge." As they approached the station, Jacob's unease grew. It was a massive, sprawling structure, a tangle of modules and docking bays that seemed to have been haphazardly welded together. Ships of all shapes and sizes swarmed around it like flies around a carcass. They docked in a dimly lit bay, the air thick with the stench of fuel and sweat. As they disembarked, Jacob noticed a group of rough-looking aliens eyeing their ship with interest. He kept one hand on his plasma pistol as they made their way through the station's grungy corridors, Pollux clinging tightly to his other hand. Zephyr's workshop was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the station, a cramped, dimly lit space filled with humming servers and flickering holographic displays. The hacker himself was a wiry, fidgety human with a wild shock of neon-green hair and darting, suspicious eyes. "Well, look what the Astrocat dragged in," he chuckled as they entered, his gaze flicking from Alistair to Jacob to Pollux. "Thought you Sentinels were all stardust." Alistair stepped forward, his face grim. "We need your help, Zephyr. We have some encrypted coordinates that we need to crack. It's a matter of life and death." Zephyr's grin faded as Alistair explained the situation. He scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Sounds like some heavy shit," he said finally. "I'll take a look, but I ain't making no promises. This kind of encryption, it's a bitch to crack, could take days." Jacob's heart sank, but he nodded. "We don't have a choice. Do what you can." As Zephyr set to work, hunched over his console, Jacob and Alistair took turns keeping watch. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a moment. The collective could be lurking around any corner. Hours stretched into days, the tension mounting with each passing moment. Pollux grew increasingly restless, plagued by nightmares and flashbacks of the horrors she'd endured. Jacob did his best to comfort her, telling her stories of Earth, of the green hills and blue oceans of his homeworld, but the words felt hollow even to him. Finally, after 3 sleepless days and nights, Zephyr let out a triumphant whoop. "Got it!" he crowed, spinning around in his chair. "The coordinates, they lead to some remote, uncharted system deep in the galactic core. Never heard of it before." Alistair leaned in, his eyes widening as he scanned the data. "I have," he breathed. "It's the location of an ancient Sentinel outpost, long abandoned and thought lost. We used to tell stories about it back in the day, said it was a place of great power and great danger." Shit, he muttered. "It's the collective. They've found us. You need to get out of here now." Jacob scooped up Pollux and raced for the door, Alistair hot on his heels. They sprinted through the corridors, the sound of shouting and plasma fire echoing behind them. They burst into the docking bay just as a group of collective ships descended on the station, their hulls gleaming with deadly intent. They leapt into their ship, Jacob's hands shaking as he punched in the coordinates for the Sentinel outpost. The engines roared to life, and they blasted away from the Razor's Edge, the station receding behind them. But even as they hurtled through the void, Jacob couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled in his gut. They were heading into the unknown, into a place that even the Sentinels feared to tread, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the collective wouldn't be far behind. The ship shuddered violently as the shock wave slammed into the hull, sending Jacob and Alistair sprawling across the deck. The lights flickered and died, plunging the interior into darkness. Jacob hauled himself to his feet, his heart pounding. He staggered to the cockpit, peering out the viewport. The stars stretched and warped around them, elongating into sickly streaks of light. The ship groaned, the metal shrieking under the strain of the anomaly's inexorable pull. Pollux whimpered, burying her face in Jacob's side. "We're caught in some kind of gravitational vortex," Alistair said, his voice tight with fear as he checked the sensors. "It's dragging us towards the center of the system." Jacob watched helplessly as the ship plunged into the swirling maelstrom of shadow and distorted space. The stars spun dizzyingly beyond the viewport, a kaleidoscope of twisted light. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The ship emerged into a realm of eerie, unnatural stillness. A massive structure loomed before them, a colossal station of black metal veined with pulsing green light. As they docked, an oppressive silence enveloped the ship. The air felt thick, cloying, laden with an unseen threat. They moved cautiously through the station's echoing halls, their footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. Strange glyphs glowed on the walls, pulsing in time with the sickly light. Pollux clung to Jacob, her small body trembling. Suddenly, a piercing scream ripped through the silence. Jacob and Alistair spun, plasma pistols raised, but the corridor behind them was empty. The scream came again, closer, a flicker of movement in the shadows. They backed away slowly, hearts hammering, as a nightmarish creature emerged from the darkness. It was vaguely humanoid, but its flesh writhed with pulsing tendrils and cancerous growths. More creatures appeared, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. Jacob and Alistair opened fire, plasma bolts searing through twisting flesh, but for every creature they felled, 2 more took its place. They retreated deeper into the station, the creatures' shrieks echoing behind them. They burst into a vast chamber, dominated by a towering machine that pulsed with an inner light. Alistair's breath caught, the Nexus key. But as they approached, a familiar voice rang out behind them. Jacob turned to see Rix, a plasma rifle aimed at his chest. Rix grinned, his face a mask of cruel triumph. "Did you really think you could keep the girl from us?" he sneered. "The collective always gets what it wants." Cold dread settled in Jacob's gut as the truth crashed over him. Rix had betrayed them, had been working for the collective all along, and now, with the Nexus key within their grasp, the collective's ultimate plan could finally unfold. The cold muzzle of Rix's plasma rifle pressed against Jacob's temple. Rix's eyes glinted with a feral, triumphant light as he motioned for his collective forces to surround them. Jacob's heart pounded in his ears, his mind racing for a way out. But there was none. They were trapped, outgunned and outmaneuvered. Alistair met Jacob's gaze, a grim understanding passing between them. There was only one thing left to do. In a flash they raised their weapons and opened fire on the Nexus key, pouring every last ounce of plasma into the ancient machine. The key shuddered and convulsed under the onslaught, its sickly green light pulsing erratically. Rix screamed in rage, ordering his men to stop them. Plasma bolts scorched the air around Jacob and Alistair, but they didn't falter. They kept firing, even as the key began to spark and smoke, its surface cracking under the relentless barrage. With a final blinding flash, the Nexus key exploded. A massive shockwave of dark energy burst outward, engulfing the station. Jacob felt himself lifted off his feet, thrown through the air like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. For a long moment he lay stunned, his vision swimming. When he finally managed to push himself up, he found the central chamber in ruins. Twisted metal and shattered stone littered the floor, but the collective forces were gone, vanished as if they'd never existed. Alistair staggered to his feet, his face ashen. "We have to go," he rasped. "The station's coming apart." Jacob scooped up Pollux and they ran, sprinting through the collapsing corridors. Debris rained down around them, the ground buckling beneath their feet. They barely made it to their ship before the station imploded, folding in on itself in a swirling maelstrom of dark energy. As they watched the remains of the station disappear into the void, Alistair slumped into his seat, his head in his hands. "The key," he whispered hoarsely. "It wasn't just an artifact, it was a prison, and we just set free something very old and very evil." Jacob's blood ran cold. He looked out at the stars, suddenly feeling very small and very vulnerable. The galaxy had just become a much darker, much more dangerous place. They limped back to Earth, their ship barely holding together. When they broke atmosphere, Jacob's heart sank. The skies were black, roiling with unnatural storms. Massive vortexes of dark energy swirled above the cities, tendrils of inky black reaching down to ensnare the minds of those below. They sat down at a secure EDF facility, and Jacob helped a shell-shocked Pollux out of the ship. Alistair was grim-faced as he spoke to the EDF commanders, explaining the situation. "There may be a way to stop this," he said, "but it will require a terrible sacrifice." Jacob closed his eyes. He knew what Alistair was asking, and he knew he had no choice. With a heavy heart, he agreed. They left Pollux in the care of the EDF, promising to return for her once the threat had been dealt with. But as they blasted off, rising up through the tortured skies, Jacob knew in his heart that he would never see her again. The details of their final mission would never be known, only that they succeeded at the cost of everything. Alistair didn't make it back. He gave his life to seal the breach, to put an end to the evil they had unleashed. Jacob returned to Earth alone, a broken man. He went to the EDF facility, hoping to find Pollux to keep his promise to her. But she was gone, vanished without a trace. In the end, he had saved the galaxy, but he had lost everything that mattered. Pollux was gone, and he knew he would never stop searching for her. He had to believe she was still out there somewhere, waiting for him. And so he wandered, a ghost drifting among the stars, forever seeking the one he had failed, forever haunted by the weight of his mistakes. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.